Yes, if you want, we can answer a question to give us a little break, and I would say you should continue with the topic.
Yes, yes.
Go ahead.
What he brings.
Early Christianity. Well, this early Christianity is generally understood as the first period of Christianity, when there still isn't a big separation between what we know as Judaism and Christianity. So we can contribute from all 3 points of view. What teachings of Jesus and the apostles help us understand the figure of Satan in early Christianity? Carlos.
Look, what teachings of Jesus and the apostles help us understand the figure of Satan? There is one. I have a scripture written down here. Oh, I lost it. Okay. Sorry, beloved ones, I had a text here, but it's the text to answer that question. It's the passage where Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me." It's during the supper. Sorry about the text. I understand that this passage helps us to understand something. Of course, I know and understand that Jesus, being a first century apocalyptic Jew with a message about the kingdom, believed in the devil. Not as a descriptive adjective, but as something real, because a long time ago, I understand that the character has already evolved to become an emissary. Notice that he says, "Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me." The question is, what did Jesus want to teach by that? He meant it technically that yes, Jesus thought the devil got into Peter, because I understand that demons are the ones who possess. The devil never possesses anyone. The devil tempts, the ones who possess are the demons. The question would be, and this has always been something I've wondered about, when Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me," a stumbling block. When the devil entered Peter's mouth through a bite of food, I understand that it's because Jesus thought the devil was real. But in this case, Jesus uses the term Satan. It's like saying you're letting yourself be used, you're making yourself a stumbling block to me out of sentimentality so that I won't die on the cross. I understand that in Jesus' time, the character of the devil was a synonym for someone trying to hinder you from fulfilling your purpose. Go ahead, Baron. Geo.
Yes, let's see. We have to understand that in that part, when he says, "Get away from me because you are a stumbling block to me, get away from me, Satan," he is clearly not referring to the evil angel, but rather it's a completely Jewish motif. He is simply telling Peter that he was opposing God's path as such. So, what was it? In this case, he was an opponent to the path that Jesus believed was correct or true. So clearly the word Satan is used, but not to describe the angel, but simply the action he was carrying out. In this case, the disciple. We also have another issue, is Jesus in the desert being tempted by Satan. In this part, we can already see that the notion of the angel tempting does exist. Why? Because we could say this from a certain perspective. All right, Jesus is struggling with his own temptation, with his own projection of what he could achieve, etc. But the text is explicit in saying that the angel took him to see the kingdoms of the earth, that there is a whole dialogue between two characters. Therefore, as I understand it, I can accept that in this part, already in early Christianity, when the scribes, because after all, the apostles didn't write anything about the life of Jesus, it was later scribes who did, they begin to narrate this topic. They already had a very different perception of Satan himself, or the actions were much more, how could we say, personally directed at Jesus. Because clearly it was the same Satan as the one from before, from the second temple, if we could say it that way, a tempter, a being who had power as such, etc. But now it gets quite personal. And why? Because we're talking about the New Testament. The main character is Jesus. Therefore, he has to be given a story of temptation and everything. So in this regard, he is already seen from this perspective. And also the other thing is the use toward the disciple that was already mentioned, perspective. He is already seen from this perspective. And also the other thing is the use toward the disciple that Carlos mentioned, who was being spoken to in this part. He uses the word Satan to refer to the disciple. But in another instance, we see Satan as a figure having a conversation with Jesus. Jacob.
No, he's trying to cross-reference things in rabbinic literature. And the thing is, in rabbinic literature, especially from that era, the Tanaitic period, Satan is hardly ever personified. There are only two extreme cases where something similar is mentioned. One example is Rabbi Meir in Tractate Gittin. Two people are fighting, and after he reconciles them, one says, I have nothing left, and Satan says, they have driven me from my home. It's like a personification. And another is when Satan tempts Rabbi Akiva by taking the form of a woman. It's like, but it's something extreme. As for the teachings of Jesus, in fact, I had a conversation some time ago with Trolanos from this same Facebook group you mentioned about how much we can actually attribute to Jesus. The teachings. I understand there is the Q source, and they try to attribute those teachings to what Jesus said. I'm not sure what Jesus taught. If we say it's because of the New Testament, I think they are distant from what Judaism of that time proposed, because when I see how Satan is presented in the New Testament, I see him personified. I see that, I don't know, he gets into Judas because I don't know why he eats vinegar or bread. It's shown like this. This is in Luke. Luke says 10, that the devil is the author of evil. It's a much more dualistic position than how conventional Judaism presents it. Again, as I mentioned before, there are more radical circles like the Qumranites, blah, 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 that do have these dualistic ideas. Maybe the proto-Christians had Essene Qumranite influences. I don't know. There are those who propose this, John the Baptist and so on. But there is something that I do think is worth mentioning. There is a part, and this is one of the most frequently quoted verses, at least during the most hostile periods of Christianity, and it's John 8:44, which accuses the Jews of being children of their father, the devil. That is to say, not only does it see a dualistic character, it also attributes to people being part of this second deity. So it seems to me that there really is a big gap between what it is and how it is. The path that Judaism decided to take versus the path of the Christian teachings that say Jesus taught. No.
Of course, not to mention that the devil is seen as you mentioned, practically as a deity, as a god.
Yes, Paul says it explicitly. Yes.
So, Carlos, anything else to add?
I think we can move on.
Okay, of course. How are the references to Satan interpreted in the Apocalypse of John? Here's a really interesting topic, and maybe I want to start here. The book of Revelation is not about fortune telling or predicting the future. Just to explain it clearly, the book is called Revelation, but it has an apocalyptic character. That's why it became more popular as Apocalypse. These are some revelations, and it's the apocalyptic character within history and within Judaism. It was a synonym for hope, for the things that were going to come. Don't worry, Jesus will come. There will be a second coming. It won't go beyond this generation. We will all see it, etc. What was done afterwards? Over time, it was reinterpreted. It was there. This text, and it even took a long time for this text to be included in the biblical canon because it was heavily debated. So the acceptance of Revelation came much later. Within this perception, Satan is referred to as the ancient serpent. And this is very interesting because here we have two perceptions. In a way, we can understand that the ancient serpent could have been the serpent from Eden, tempting since the beginning of time. Or the other perspective is that the only figure we have in Greek for the great dragon and the ancient serpent is Leviathan, which is the enemy and opponent of Yahweh within the ancient Jewish text. Why? Because if I'm not mistaken, St. Augustine, maybe there were others, he is the first one who mixes with Satan, with the serpent from Eden. But in ancient times, the serpent mentioned in the apocalyptic texts was Leviathan, which was the primordial serpent or the ancient serpent.
Of chaos.
Correct. Note this. And what's the comparison in another culture? Tiamat and Marduk. Yahweh splits Tiamat in two. She was one of the serpents because the other one stays alive. Basically, Tiamat is split in two. He makes the heavens, the earth, and so on. He puts everything in order. And in Genesis, we have God bringing order and dividing the waters and so on. So there's a comparison there with this primordial chaos. Because remember that in the beginning, everything was chaos, if we could call it that. Baju. Well, Jacob will explain that part better. And clearly what Yahweh does is organize what was there. And within the text of Marduk, it's something similar. Order, let's say, overcomes chaos. And that's where creation comes from. And that's why that many times the term dragon or ancient serpent refers to this sea serpent. To this ancient serpent that is representative of chaos and opposition to God since the beginning of time. But of course, we also have the later perception that has to do with the serpent of Eden. And I think there must be some Talmudic treatises that connect it with Satan and the serpent and all that. I think Jacob has more knowledge in that area. I don't know if, Yaakov, do you want to say something? Or Carlos?
Yes. I think that was the point, what the text shows you, for example, in Bereshit, in Genesis. It's quite different from that narrative. What it talks about is a war like that of Marduk and Tiamat. A struggle. What Bereshit says is something different. It says that it is God who creates everything. He also doesn't create Leviathan. That is to say, the Jewish cosmogony places the God of Israel above these little squabbles between gods. It comes from a different point of view. One moment, Jacob.
Do you know why he puts it that way? Because from the study, Bereshit is a Bereshit. It's an interpretation that in a way tries to go against the Babylonian narrative. Exactly. That's why, just like all of Isaiah. Correct.
Just like the first 39 chapters of Isaiah are, from around chapter 20 to 39, they are a mockery of the surrounding cultures. Isaiah, for example, mentions the devil, Lucifer. Lucifer is Isaiah's mockery of Babylonian theology, a satire.
Yes, it's a satire.
Of Hillel ben Shahar. They translate that as Osphorus, the god of light. And that's Lucifer, yes, light, god of light. But they're always mockeries Isaiah makes. Also the subject of the serpent and all that. In the end, Hashem kills Nahash HaNahashabaria with his sword. That's what they translated as Dracontophan, the dragon serpent. And that's where all these, let's say, linguistic complications come from that we find today after 2,000 years, 2,600, well, actually 400. But something I would like to mention is about the title itself as it appears there. I mean, that's just my perception. I'm not an expert in Christianity or anything. But when I opened the New Testament and read those parts, they seemed very different to me from what Judaism presents. The fact that there is a character who is rebellious against God, but rebellious in the sense that he's a celestial being in rebellion, this is something that doesn't exist in the Jewish conception, because all celestial beings are subordinate to God. And here we see that Revelation 12, we see the struggle and all of it. Or for example, it is also used in this book of Revelation. Satan is used as an epithet, or the devil, as appellatives against the Jews who do not believe in Christian doctrine. That's what he says to them. This is in chapter 2, 9 and 3-9, synagogue of Satan. So it's also used, just like I explained earlier about the Gospel of John, the same thing in the Apocalypse of John. It's used as an appellative to refer to the Jews. It's used as creating a dualism around God. It seems to me that it's a narrative again. There's a big gap between the direction that Judaism decided to take. And about the last thing you mentioned, which was, yes, about the identification of the serpents with Eden, with Satan, all of that. In Judaism, let's say in the Midrashim and all that, yes. Also in the Toseftas and everything, it is mentioned that Satan is also referred to by other names, like the Yetzer Hara, which is like the evil inclination. Samael, he is also identified. Also in the scene of Eden, he is identified as one who is present. Samael is there, so he can be identified as such. Maybe it's a reference to Satan as a concept, as the concept of a representation of something negative, something evil, and it is represented with different names, among them Samael, etc. So yes, that identification could be made. Again, the topic of the serpent, I think it is more related. In the serpent of Eden, it is more related to the translation of Isaiah 27, which was translated as Nahash HaNahashabaria, as Dracontophan. And from there, the idea evolved to think that it is also in Eden. That's my position. But basically...
A translation thing, a question. Jacob, do you see in the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim, do you see that part as that from there all of creation begins, or an order begins?
No, I see it as if it's another one of the worlds that were created. And yes, it's an order.
Yes, it's order, of course. So in this case.
But we're live, don't record. In fact,
let me see.
It's just that it's a very intriguing chapter.
Whoever reads the verses will understand that it's not very clear what it says there.
It says,
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but the Ruach, the spirit of Hashem, was over the water. But when did he create the water? So, was the water already created? Then it says that God separated light from darkness and started to organize what was already created, and that everything was mixed up. So it's much more complex, isn't it?
of course, that's why the comparison with the Babylonian story in a way has to do with, let's see, the sea or the ocean. The abyss is not created as such in the literature, especially in Babylonian literature. Chaos, the representation of the ocean, of the sea, is primordial. I mean, it's not created either. And from there, let's say the creatures or the gods are born. In this case, the fact that the spirit of Yahweh was in the water is also a reference in a certain way. Clearly, it's not the same because these are clearly opposing ideas. I mean, the idea of the Jewish Bereshit is to go against the Enuma Elish. So, what happens? Resources are taken, resources are shared, but clearly there's an attempt to convey a notion that pushes back against the polytheistic view in favor of a monotheistic one when Bereshit begins, because Bereshit starts as something monotheistic.
In fact, this isn't in Bereshit, but in Exodus, where it is said that, and this is a story that has a very significant historical core, because it's an ethos of the Jewish people, and it's very hard to believe there isn't a historical core. That's the position of major scholars. And it's the topic of the Exodus, particularly the importance of God parting the sea. What you're saying, that's exactly the point. What? Hashem, he takes Yamba, how do you say it? Babaka Ayamit, he breaks Yamit. Yam means sea in Hebrew. Yeah. He shatters this idea of the waters, like you said. That is, the point here is purely a political one, that the God of Israel is above this God who, by the way, all of this happens in front of Baal Zephon. Exodus is using a play on words there. And that's the point there, like you said, basically, yes, thank you.
Yes, I think this one is excellent because whenever we read Second Temple Jewish literature, the literature of that era, intellectual literature, I mean, all Jewish literature is always going to exalt divinity above anyone else. I mean, that's something we already know from the scriptures. But here, this question is interesting. Okay, what can we say about the references in the Apocalypse of John? We see him as an adversary, a persecutor. Not only that, I mean, this is the theology. I'm not sure I should call him John the Apostle since I don't believe he wrote the Apocalypse. The comparison of Greeks is different. I can understand that this figure of Satan has gone so far that he even prevents journeys. We see on one occasion that the Apostle Paul was going to Macedonia. He couldn't get there. A kind of Euroclydon came. Something happened that he refers to. Satan prevented them from doing that. In other words, the idea was that any obstacle could be Satan's doing. Any obstacle that an apostle or a man of God faced on the way was technically attributed to Satan. There's a blockage. He doesn't want the gospel to be preached. He doesn't want the kingdom to expand. That's the vision he has. Even it is said that in Petra, Satan even threw water to drown the Jews. It's incredible how far that has gone.
So Satan took it really personally. The issue with the early Christians, he took it personally. Now,
Not so with the demons, Geo and Jacob here, not so with the demons in the New Testament, because there are. Well, there's an issue between science and what is religion that we can't attribute all the illnesses people believed in during the first century to demons. So we have to be careful with that because there are certain internal illnesses that they couldn't. They would see someone and attribute it to demons. That's why if someone was blind, they were considered possessed. If someone was mute, they were considered possessed. A leper or paralyzed person wasn't seen as possessed since their illnesses were visible. That's important to remember about the first century.
of course, and well, we also have to understand that in a certain way we already have it. The example of the story of the Gadarene, the demon-possessed man, which already practically at that time. Well, this topic is interpreted in two ways. One way is through the concept of hidden transcripts, which would be, for example, this type of literature that went against Rome. Therefore, since in that area those in charge were a legion with the banner of the boar itself, then they try to call them pigs, etc. There is a position that narrates that in reality they were not demons as such, but rather that a message is being conveyed in that way. Like, remember, they are included in the transcript and literature of subjugated peoples. So clearly you couldn't say to the Roman, hey, Roman, you're a pig. Obviously not, because you're not a Roman citizen, and one of the harshest punishments awaited you. So what happens? That one position reflects that this account actually refers to a hidden transcript. Now, what about the other thing? The other thing is that there were already clearly Jews who, at that time and for that period, already believed in demonic possession, that demons entered people and they drove them crazy. So that's also the other position, which is, let's say, one of the most common ones that still exists today in Christianity.
That's exactly right.
Middle Ages. And
Guido,
If you allow, I can stay for the last question before leaving.
okay, if you want, we can finish with this question, and then let's say we can leave the topic that was voted for another time. Here, Yaakov held a vote, and we're going to talk about the Messiah. He dares to talk about the Messiah.
So it's a difficult topic.
Yes, it's complicated. Well, last question then.
okay.
How did the figure of Satan evolve during the Middle Ages in Christian theology? How so, Carlos?
Yes, it evolved quite a lot to the point that the church, at least the Catholic Church, I don't know because I'm not Catholic, I'm evangelical. At least I think that, at least I feel that the character of Satan has a lot of weight, more so in the evangelical church. At least in Pentecostal circles, more than in Baptist circles, because I know the Baptist doctrine and it's something else. In my branch, among evangelicals, I think this figure has been distorted to an extreme degree. That when someone talks about the devil in a testimony or in a sermon, you pull out the Bible, you pull out any of them, or you pull out the Torah or the Tara or whatever it is. You might ask, which character is this preacher referring to? I don't see what he's describing here. Where is he getting all that? I think the character, ever since they paint him red, they give him horns, they give him a tail, an arrow. I mean, they give him a trident, they put him in hell. Since when is the devil in hell? I mean, that's not in the Tanakh. It's not in intertestamental literature. None of that exists. Even in the canonical epistles in Peter's letter, who is in Tartarus, it says it's angels who rebelled against God. Satan is never there. The character changed in a terrible evangelical way. Even at the same level as Yahweh, here in certain evangelical circles, it's difficult to engage in a serious historical critical dialogue about that. Why? Because we've been shaped by so many layers of theology over so many years that if in Puerto Rico the devil attacked my congregation at 2:30, over in Venice the same devil attacked and destroyed the church at the same time. My people, that's theologically impossible. It doesn't exist in theology. That this idea of Satan being here and there was invented, that doesn't exist in the biblical account. That doesn't exist. Even Jesus as a human is limited, because if Jesus was with the Gadarene, he couldn't be at Zacchaeus' house at the same time. Go ahead, Gio.
Of course, the idea of Satan clearly evolves a lot. For example, we have before it starts to emerge in the church, with the church fathers making certain contributions, and then into the Middle Ages, around the 5th century of our era onward. From there on, several ideas begin to emerge. For example, the idea of Lucifer as such begins to appear already in a reconstructed way that was supposedly being talked about. From Isaiah 14:12, if I'm not mistaken, where it talks about the king of Babylon. And if you, of course, go further back, you'll read verse 4, you'll read the satire. You'd call it a satire. I think it says Proverbs in Spanish, in the Reina Babylonia. But in a certain way, they try to interpret this morning star, since in ancient times the morning star represented Venus as such. But when it begins much later after Isaiah, it begins to be understood within the Greek world as Hesperos. It starts to be understood as Hesperos and Phosphoros, like what we understand in Greek mythology. But this wasn't understood during the time of the Septuagint as such, but rather it begins already in the Christian theological context. And previously, a certain portion also among the Jews, since Jacob doesn't like the hereditary Jews. But what happens? This starts to become quite an interesting evolution, where the morning star, Venus, begins to be seen as a Greek god, as the bearer of light, as the one who brings the light. And in the first versions of what's called the Vulgate, already in Latin, it's rendered in Latin as Lucifer, meaning morning star. And I don't remember in which later edition it appears with a capital letter. And even though it's just grammar, the change is intentional to turn morning star, a common word, into a personal name with a capital letter to give it a certain importance. So they start creating this narrative that supposedly, before being Satan, this angel was Lucifer as such. So it starts being interpreted in the church from around the 6th century onward. Why not before? Because if we look at the Easter proclamation from the Catholic Church, where it is compared to the light, just like in Revelation 20:20 or 22, when it is reflected, who was the morning star, both in the Easter proclamation and in Revelation? Jesus. But what happens sometime later? It starts to become isolated in that way. And well, by the Middle Ages, we have a much stronger evolution with the arrival of the Codex, Gigas, or Gigas as it's called, which many people know, which transforms the figure of the devil, that is, from Satan to the more popular devil. There is a whole mythology behind the story of that Codex, clearly a mythological narrative. But a belief that didn't exist before starts to become popular. Even when syncretism began, the Christianization, they started to be given to the pagan peoples who were from the villages by people who lived in a certain way, not within the Roman sector. They began to be demonized or demonized or demon. Help me with the word. And well,
Demonology?
no, it's demonized, demonized. Because of that collapse, they start to demonize all the figures, for example, that existed from other cultures, which they started to call pagan from that moment on, from then on, in the rural areas. So they start to demonize, for example, I don't know, Cernunnos, for example, and other deities that we can see later on that have certain bodily features, goat legs, like some horns, etc. And over time, certain stories and certain cultural myths begin to form within the very concept of this devil. And that's how it evolves over time.
Those figures are satyrs, geosatyrs. With goat legs, they're satyrs. They're a kind of demon.
Yes, within Greek mythology, they would be satyrs. And the nymphs, which is the other part of it. But within Celtic mythology, it would be Cernunnos. That's Cernunnos. Practically a god. Interesting. Well, that, and even nowadays, we have our grandfather telling us he fought the devil at 3 in the morning. I mean, we already have thousands of myths and stories. And of course, later on, we have the topic of Baphomet, which was mixed or intertwined with the figure of Satan. Since Baphomet represents the Hermetic laws and is very different from the more familiar idea of Satan, and actually, it has nothing to do with it. That's right.
And also to give the floor to Yeko so we can start saying goodbye. And also, the evolution of Satan has reached the point where a philosophy has been created within the world of Satanism. For example, those who have read this Bible, which I have read twice, for me, this is pure philosophy. It's not something like my bed moves or I'm seeing shadows, nothing like that. In fact, Alton LaVey, in his philosophy as a Satanist, he is against witches, against Santeria practitioners, against Christianity. Because why? Because for him, Satan is a lifestyle. In other words, the words of Jesus, Anton LaVey rejects them because Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the cheek or on the face, turn the other cheek. And he says that anyone who bows down to the enemy will always be abused by him. Satanism teaches the opposite. You can't let your enemy walk all over you.
Of course, and that's what it says here.
There's nothing more. It's philosophy.
Of course, LaVey's Satanism is practically philosophy. Yes, just philosophy. That's it.
No, I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about Christian theology in the Middle Ages. What I understand is that the Middle Ages was a period of development. It's a term that has, let's say, been demonized a lot, that the Middle Ages was a dark age. Everything was bad. In fact, in the West, there was quite a bit of development, particularly in philosophy, theology, and debate. There was sophistication in how things were conceived. There's a relatively extensive literature on these kinds of topics because these were the issues that concerned them. People today worry about things like gender ideology and the dollar, just as people back then had their own concerns. So that's why it's not surprising that the way a devil is represented became more sophisticated. Works like The Divine Comedy, which greatly shape how Europe conceives of hell and what the devil is doing down there. They are simply theological discussions that took place. Judaism had a parallel process to what the Christians were doing. Obviously, it had repercussions on how Judaism was presented, so that Judaism had to respond because that's generally how it was. Any interaction was due to discussions like this. So that's why you can see in rabbinic literature these kinds of responses about the nature of evil or why there are righteous people who suffer, all these kinds of things. But you won't find representations of the devil. That's something you won't find in Judaism because art in Judaism simply wasn't something that was developed during all this time, apart from Byzantine mosaics, but that would basically be it. And what does happen is that Kabbalah develops during the Middle Ages, and Kabbalah does delve deeply into the subject of Satan, even making parallels with Amalek and things like that. But basically, so I don't go on too long, I'll stop there. And thank you for inviting me, Guido. Thanks to Carlos for being here, and thanks to everyone who was present as well for being here. Something I like to close with is, with or without the devil, don't go blaming some external entity. You should be good people, whether there is or isn't one. The idea is to make this world a better place. And that's all. I send you my regards.
Excellent.
Of course. Yes, anyway, thank you very much to everyone who was here. I send you all a hug. Remember that our respective channels are Espacio Histórico and Agora el Podcast. So thank you all very much for being here.